Olin, and salutations to the truth core. You know who you are, wherever you may be on the planet. I'm here this morning, September 3rd, 2021, to tell you something about non-ordinary reality. I've been reflecting quite a bit on telling you this, on how to say it and when to say it, and to what purpose. You may already detect that I am quite careful about what I say and how I say it. Not always, and I talk a lot, but my primary intention is always to speak precisely and to frame what I say in the best possible way so that it can reach you. And in this particular case, I've considered those factors closely. So first off, I want to say that my reality is non-ordinary. It's also ordinary. So I can do ordinary things. I can build things, make things, repair things. I can drive a car. I can read and write. And at the same time, there is something about my experience that is non-ordinary, and it always has been. Now, on the one hand, that's a huge advantage to me. And on the other hand, it can be somewhat of a handicap or disadvantage. And on that second count, I rely on you. Whenever I speak to you, I rely on you to use your intelligence at its best and assess what I say. I never ask anyone to take what I say on faith, to just believe me out of the blue. No, I wouldn't enjoy that. What I enjoy is when my way of speaking to you invites you to an innate knowing that you already have, so that I confirm it, and maybe even in some way, by what I say. Through what I say, you can see how to locate and sense that inner knowing in yourself and develop it to the highest degree. In one respect, this practice that I do, the living gnosis today, I call it, resembles science. And it is, in fact, a kind of science. It's a genre. Technically, it's called noetic psychology, or simply noetics, which is from the Greek word nous, meaning intelligence. And as you probably know by now, if you've listened to me before, that the word nous is central to the Gnostic message to humanity. It's central to what comes to us in the legacy of the ancient Gnostics. They taught that nous is the factor, the faculty of divine intelligence endowed in the human species. And in that sense, you have a share of the divine. You participate in it through your intelligence, which is, of course, not merely the intelligence of your mind or intellect. It's also the intelligence of your emotions, your intuition, what you dream, and what you imagine. And ultimately, it is the intelligence of your body which knows a lot more than you can ever think that you know. And yet that intelligence of the body, the profound cellular intelligence, is there to be infinitely enhanced and developed. So my purpose, one of my purposes, in what I'm going to say today, is to speak more directly than ever to that factor of innate divine knowing that is in you. It's your inheritance as a human animal coming directly from the Divine Mother. So what is non-ordinary reality? Well, quite simply, it's the reality that you experience when you couple and coordinate the intelligence of your body with the intelligence of her body, the body of the earth, the mother planet. She also has a body. Isn't that obvious? She also has a body intelligence, and she has thoughts, or the equivalent of thoughts, perceptions, memories, emotions, that's the weather, and intentions. You can call all of those functions the ensemble of the psyche. So, of course, you have a psyche. It's from the Greek word, which literally means butterfly. You have a psyche composed of those functions that you use in an ordinary way every day, but you can also use them in non-ordinary ways. But that is only possible in one instance, by that coupling with the psyche of the earth. Now, there's a name for the psyche of the earth, the anima mundi, or soul of the world. And if you go back and research into the past, there's a considerable body of knowledge that came through individuals who were attuned to the anima mundi. There are other names that have been attached to it in various schools of philosophy in the West, in Hermetics, and in the Greek sciences. It has been called the planetary entelechy, that comes from Aristotle, or more simply, the planetary logos. So there were times in the past when people were far more attuned to the psyche of the world than they are today. And recovering that attunement is, I would say, the central and imperative requirement to correct the evil and error that prevails in the world today, and to bring humanity back, heading in the right direction in its proper course of evolution. I won't say any more about the conditions of realizing non-ordinary reality. Rather, I'll give you a direct and concrete example. But I want you to remember as I speak that the living gnosis today depends upon evidence and proof, just like any other science. And for me, speaking to you in this way, in this medium, although I would prefer to speak to you non-recorded and directly, for me, your reception is the proof of what I say. So with that little prelude, let's get to the question. What's rocking the boat? To begin, I'll cite a fact of science. an alleged fact. Now, I can't verify this fact as I can verify what I'm going to say after, but it's part of the picture I'm developing here. It's part of the total picture that I want you to see as I am proceeding. Astronomers have been working to understand what happens in the large-scale picture of the cosmos for quite a number of years. And one of the turning points in that knowledge occurred in the 30s when Edwin Hubble realized that a certain small blotch in the sky that had been observed from ancient times was actually an external galaxy floating in intergalactic space. That's the galaxy of Andromeda, M31. And the current model of science, of astronomical science, says that that is a neighbor galaxy, an island universe. So the Earth, the Sun, and the planets are like a fleet of ships traveling through the third arm of this galaxy. This is the big picture that's been developed since Hubble. And from this arm of the galaxy, we can actually look out and see another galaxy. And you can see it with the naked eye, by the way. And it is said to be the most distant object visible to the naked eye. And it is said to be something like 2.1 million light years away, or whatever. I don't put much credit on the concept of light years. But the fact is that you, with your senses and your ordinary power of attention, can go out at night and see what this is. Whether or not you wholly accept the description that science gives us about how the galaxy is structured, where the Earth is, and how the galaxies float in intergalactic space, in that infinite darkness. Whether or not you accept that entire picture, it's just a picture, you can actually confirm this object in your own perception. Now, the other thing that they say is that the Earth follows the Sun, which is like a large ship in a fleet of ships, the Earth being smaller, and it follows the Sun as the Sun travels through the galactic arms. Now, they have determined the direction in which the Sun travels. They say that it travels toward a point near the constellation of Hercules that can be determined closely by the star Vega, which you can also observe. And they call that the solar apex. So imagine a fleet of ships, the Sun being the largest ship, the Earth and the other planets being smaller, and they are following spiral paths through space, going in the direction of the solar apex at a certain velocity. Now, I'm not confirming any of this. I'm giving you now first the setup for what I can confirm. Now, something that's really interesting in this description coming from the genre of astronomical physics, something I find really fascinating is this. They say that the fleet of planets led by the Sun is traveling in the galactic arm in the manner of ships on the sea, but in fact, the Earth and other planets are embedded in the arm. They are more like submersibles. They're not floating on top of the water. They're actually down in the water being the narrow band of the galactic arm. And they say, and I don't know how they determined this, that over long periods of time, tens of thousands of years, that the Earth behaves like a dolphin. And sometimes it goes deeper down into the stream of the galactic arm, and sometimes it comes up. And so it goes up and down and up and down like a dolphin swimming. And it does this, they say, over tens of thousands of years. So, obviously, that's a scientific concept. And it's developed in whatever way they develop their concepts, relying upon a lot of instruments and calculations. And I can't verify that that is true. But let's just assume for a minute that there is something valuable, something correct in that picture. Were that so, then the description of the Earth diving and rising as it floats through the galactic arms would be compatible with the way you describe the motion of a ship. And when a ship moves on the water, the ship is, of course, on the water rather than in it. It's subject to 6 different motions at the same time. I'm only going to talk about 3 of them, and they are called pitch, roll, and yaw, Y-A-W. So what I just described, by reference to a scientific model, which I cannot confirm, is the pitch of the Earth ship, the mother ship. She pitches up toward a great wave. She goes over the wave, down, comes to another wave, up again and down. And those waves are actually motions that occur, massive currents that are continually running in the galactic arm where the Earth, Sun, and other planets are traveling. Is that all clear? So, of those 3 actions in nautical terms, pitch, roll, and yaw, let's say that pitch is undetectable to you. You and I cannot in any way observe anything in the natural world or in the movement of the Earth through the sky, day and night, in the rotation of the Earth, in its passage around the sun, which is not a closed circle but a spiral, a screw line. Sitting here on the mother ship, we cannot actually detect pitch. All right? But what about the other 2 factors, roll and yaw? Is it possible to detect those motions of the mother ship? Perhaps you, like myself, in the course of your life, has had the occasion to travel on certain different kinds of boats. Boat being something small, ship being larger. So you might paddle in a canoe across the lake or down a river. You might sail in a larger boat, such as a 2-masted sailboat or a large fishing boat. And you might have had occasion to travel on a really large ocean vessel, such as an ocean liner or a cargo vessel, as I have had occasion to do in both cases. Now, obviously, the smaller the vessel, consider a canoe or rowboat, the more likely you are to detect the motion of the craft. But when it gets larger, like when you're on a huge ocean liner, well, the ship can experience those 3 functions, pitch, roll, and yaw, depending on the condition of the seas and the weather, and you won't necessarily be able to detect them unless they become extreme. And I have been on ocean liners and tankers in really extreme conditions, a typhoon in the South China Seas once. So when the motion of the sea is strong, you can certainly detect that motion. You can feel it and see it as a passenger on the vessel. But then again, go to the next stage. How large is the vessel? The larger the vessel, the less likely you are able to sense its motion. And there's no better example of that than the mother ship herself. So right now, as I'm speaking to you, the mother ship, if you picture it as a sphere, is rotating on its axis. And the velocity of rotation at the equator is 1,000 miles an hour, and relatively different at other latitudes. So right now you're on a spinning body that's rotating at a really high velocity, but you don't feel anything, do you? Why not? Because the vessel is so large that the motions of it are not normally detectable to you, but they are there if you know how to observe them. For instance, if you observe the setting sun or the full moon setting, it takes about 2 minutes for the moon or sun to cross the horizon and disappear. 2 minutes. So if you're looking west and you see the full moon go down, you are in a way detecting the spin of the earth on its axis as it turns away from the moon, and the moon appears to sink, and does sink, beneath the local horizon. So in that way you have detected one of the motions of the earth. The other motion, of course, is the circular path of the earth around the sun, which I've said is not a closed circle, but it's an open spiral. It's a screw line, like the grooves on a screw. Since the earth follows the sun as it moves toward the solar apex, the circle of the earth's orbit is drawn into a spiral. That is one description. I know that there are people who dispute that description, but I'm not going to go into that debate right now. I've talked about it at length in other places. So what is, or what is said to be, the velocity of the earth in its screw-like motion? 64,000 miles an hour, which is about 18.6 miles a second. 3 seconds. Did you sense anything? Did you feel the motion? Did you feel the velocity of 18 miles per second? Now imagine that you were in a small capsule, a rocket, and you were traveling at 18 miles a second. You would certainly feel something. As I've said, what you can detect of motion depends upon the size of the vehicle of motion. And the size of the earth is so large, the mothership is so immense and designed to be that way, so that you have the comfort in your cabin, or as you stand on deck or walk around the ship, you have the comfort of acting as if it doesn't move at all. See, you have both. You have the motion and the sensation of not moving. It's not one or the other. It's both. I offer that as an example so that you can register the fact that the earth is such an immense vessel that you are free to move around on that vessel and not be troubled by the macro scale motions of the vessel. How wonderful is that? You might think that it was designed to be that way precisely for your comfort. But how does all this go back to those two other factors? Roll and yaw. it's fair to say that apart from observing the motion of the planets and the stars rising and setting, you don't know that the Earth is rotating. You infer it from the motion that you detect in the skies. And the ancient sky watchers for untold millennia have detected and studied and mapped those motions. How do you think they were able to construct the Great Pyramid in perfect alignment to the stellar environment? Or how were they able to construct such megalithic sites, for instance, as Kallanish in the Hebrides, where there is an alignment to the northern lunar standstill, which occurs every 18.6 years, a precise alignment? How were they able to do that without instruments? They did it through their powers of observation and through their ability to experience reality in a non-ordinary way. Now, my purpose in this talk is to describe to you the experience, the direct perceptual experience of the roll and yaw of the mother ship. I can't absolutely confirm what I've said previously, for instance, about the velocity of the Earth or its rotational speed, by direct evidence of my mind and senses. But that is not the case for what I'm going to describe now. In March of 2011, not 10 years ago, I launched, if you'll accept the nautical metaphor, I launched a project on the internet called the Gaian Navigation Experiment. And it consisted of many talks and some text and illustrations. And I began by describing the structure and mechanism of two factors of the Earth-Moon system, Earth-Moon-Sun system, actually, because they all work together. In fact, the three bodies are the totality of the body of the Aeon Sophia. So I described the lunar nodes and the lunar apsides. Now, the nodes are those points in the sky where the moon crosses the ecliptic. And the ecliptic is actually the projection of the plane of the Earth's orbit into space. That plane is also called the apparent path of the sun. So if you had a device that would allow you to look at the sun and see the constellations in the background, you could see that it follows a line through the constellations. And likewise, so does the Earth. And you can actually observe where the Earth is passing along that line in the constellations in the night sky when you have the instructions of how to do so. So that's the ecliptic plane. But there is another plane, which is the plane of the Earth's equator. So if you imagine the Earth as a globe or sphere, it has a central line, a waistline. And when you project that line into the cosmos, it also marks out in the sky a round circle of particular constellations, which are landmarks in the galactic arm. They're like lights on the coastline. And these two planes are arranged at an angle to each other of about 23.5 degrees. And this is a constant of celestial structure. So as the explanation goes, we have the seasons, because through 6 months of the year, the sun in the north is above the equatorial plane of the Earth, and 6 months it is below it, which is summer in the southern hemisphere. Now the moon also moves along that track, which is the orbital plane of the Earth, but it doesn't move exactly along that line. It acts like a dolphin, strangely. It imitates a dolphin. You could even say perhaps that the moon, in a short time period which you can observe, acts in the way that the Earth does over those long periods of thousands of years. It pitches up and down. So sometimes the moon is above the celestial equator and sometimes below. And the points where it crosses it are called the lunar nodes. At the north node, it goes above, and the south node, it goes below. And you can observe this. This is observable. Now, these 2 points, the lunar nodes, are not constant. They also rotate. They have their own cycle, which is, wait for it please, 18.6 years. So the north node slowly creeps along and makes a full circle in 18.6 years. And you can also observe this phenomenon when you have the description. You need a description in order to see, to know what you're seeing. Then there are the lunar apsides, A-P-S-I-D-E-S. And those are the points on the orbit of the moon where it is closer to the Earth, that's called the perigee, and more distant from the Earth, that's called the apogee. And those 2 points are not always exactly opposite each other, as the lunar nodes are, and they have very interesting cycles of motion in themselves. They also rotate in a period of about 8.6 years. But you can actually observe when the moon is in its apogee, most distant from the Earth, it is noticeably smaller. So why is the full moon sometimes quite small, and then other times the full moon is really large, which is called a supermoon? Well, at that moment, the moon is in its perigee, and it's closer to the Earth because the orbit of the moon and the Earth and all of the other planets is elliptical. It's an oval and not a perfect circle. So I described at the beginning of the Gaian navigation experiment that these astronomical factors are not merely abstractions. In the first place, they can be observed when you have the concept that shows you how to observe them. And secondly, they are mechanisms of the mothership, actual mechanisms by which she steers herself through cosmic space. So the Earth has a steering mechanism, which consists of the interlocking of the nodes and the apsides. Now, I introduced this concept at the beginning of the GNE, and then for 3 years, I trained people how to observe the steerage of the Earth as if they themselves were piloting the Earth, to participate in the Earth's direction and in the Earth's ability as a vessel to achieve autonomous motion in space. I actually taught people how to observe this, and many, many people today observe this on a monthly basis. In that way, they participate intimately with the navigation of the mother planet. Now, without dragging you through any more technicalities, I'll take you right to the question. What's rocking the boat? How could you know if the mothership navigating with this steerage mechanism, the lunar nodes and the lunar apsides, how could you know if she is rolling or if she is experiencing yaw? Now, yaw is a little more difficult to understand, but not really. Rolling is easy to understand, right? So if you're in a canoe, a very light craft, and it starts to roll to one side or another, even slightly, you'll feel it. If you're on a great ocean liner as well, and it starts to roll due to the ocean currents, You'll feel it rock and roll. One side will go up, the other will go down. And you can actually detect that. Yaw is what happens when the bow of the ship swivels to the right or left. Can you picture that? Pitch is obviously the up and down motion of the vessel. It rolls and rocks to one side or the other, and then it experiences yaw, which draws it off its direct course, either to the right or to the left. That's called a change of heading. Now, is it possible to actually detect if the mothership is undergoing these motions? Yes, it is. And I'm going to tell you how I have detected it. First, consider roll. How would you know that the Earth is undergoing roll, which, of course, you cannot experience in a certain way because the mothership is so huge that it's undetectable at your scale, but nevertheless, you could somehow, by observing the cosmic environment of the Earth, know that she is rolling to one side or rolling to the other on her journey. Well, it's simple. You look at the moon, and you look at the position of the moon relative to its nodes. Now, at those two moments in the course of every month, when the moon is in its nodes, it is exactly on the ecliptic, which is the orbital plane of the Earth. Other times it sidles a little bit above and a little bit below that line. So as I speak now, the moon has just passed through its north node a couple of days ago. So it was really close to the ecliptic. Now, the ecliptic is a consistent factor in cosmic orientation, in celestial navigation. And wherever the moon is, the sun is always on the ecliptic, and the moon is always relatively close. So when you look out, even in the daytime, and you see, say, the quarter moon in the sky, you know that you're looking at the ecliptic line or close to it. And of course, at night, when you observe the moon and you see the stars in the background, if you know how to read the starry signals, those lights on the horizon, then you can know exactly where the moon is at the same time that you know where the ecliptic is. And sometimes the moon is low, and sometimes it's high, and that means that the ecliptic is low or high. So these motions happen periodically and consistently until they don't. They happen that way, predictably, until they don't. But I would ask you, how would you know? How would you detect that they are not acting in the ordinary way unless you were thoroughly familiar of how they do act in the ordinary way, of how the moon does act as it tracks along the ecliptic? First, you have to learn to observe that and see the regular, repeatable pattern in order to detect an anomaly in that pattern. And this is what I have detected. So let me describe. As I stand facing east in the porch of this house, I see the moon rise. It always rises in the east, sometimes due east, exactly, sometimes a little south, which is to the right of east, or sometimes a little to the left. And you observe it rising over the horizon, and usually there's something on the horizon that will mark the moonrise. That happens to be a tree here. So I've been observing the moon from this place for about 4 years, and I first started to notice something inexplicable. I first started to notice that moonrise, which can vary a little bit to the right or left of due east was showing huge variations. So I would go out one evening and the moon rising would be far, far to the left. That is to say, shifted more toward the north to an extent of 30 or 40 degrees along the horizon. This is inexplicable, especially if a couple of days later it doesn't come up in the same area. So I began to notice at moonrise that there were inexplicable variations in where the moon rose. And then more recently, I noticed something even more astonishing. Picture yourself standing on the porch with me. As I say, we're not facing exactly east. It's a little off to the left. We're facing sort of, let's say, southeast, between due south and east. And there comes the moon. It comes over the horizon at a certain point, and you know that the moon, as it moves across the sky, because the earth is turning from right to left, therefore causing your perspective of the moon to change, you know that as the moon rises, it's going to follow a curve, isn't it? It's going to follow an arch. That's the arch of the ecliptic. So even though you can't see the ecliptic and you can't see the orbital plane of the Earth, you can see where it is. So the moon comes up there, and it starts to make this passage across the sky. But lo and behold, it's very, very low. So as you stand on the porch with me, you look out across the fields, and there's a grove of pine trees, pretty much at eye level across the field. And you watch the moon come up, and you might expect it to rise higher and higher to make a high arch as it moves around toward the west. But actually, the arch it makes, the trajectory, is so low on the horizon that you barely have to lift your eyes from level in order to see it. So you notice, if you've been trained to observe, that the arc of the moon is doing something anomalous. It's extraordinarily low. And not only that, but you watch where it sets, and you expect it to set way off to the right on the horizon, which is to the west, but it doesn't set in the west. It practically sets in the south. As a matter of fact, from the porch, if you look due south, there's a stone church in the woods. And that is south. And the moon, taking its low curving path through the sky, sets just on the right side of that church, just a little to the southwest. Well, this is extraordinary. How can this be? It's really not possible, but it gets even stranger. So we're out there, say, on a Thursday or Friday evening, and we're talking about this, and we're observing something strange with the moon, which means that the angle of the ecliptic shown by the moon is very, very low. So compare that to a situation in which we're in a boat, in a small boat together, and the left side of the boat, the port side, has rolled down so that it is almost, the water is almost coming over the edge of the boat, called the gunwale. So you're detecting a roll down on the left side when the moon is low. But then we go out a couple of days later, wait for the moon to come up. What's it going to do tonight? And what happens? Well, the moon comes up. As a matter of fact, when we step out of the porch and there's a roof over the porch, we know the moon has come up, but we can't see it. Where's the moon? Well, you actually have to step out from under the roof of the porch and look up, almost directly up. I won't say vertically and directly overhead, but close. And so now, just a few days after the moon has risen and traced a low arching line across the horizon, now the moon is really, really high in the sky at a very high angle. And you can compare that to what happens on the little boat when it rolls to the other side. When it rolls to the right or starboard. And so the left side of the boat is really, really high out of the water. And so the moon appears really high in the sky. You are detecting the roll of the mother ship. And this is astronomically inexplicable. Now, I assure you that probably an astronomer can explain this according to the limits of their paradigm. They can say it makes perfect sense what you're observing. But nevertheless, what does the observation tell you? Distinguish that from what an astronomer would tell you to explain this phenomenon. What does the observation tell you? Well, you know that if the moon moves on the plane of the ecliptic, then the plane of the ecliptic must be rolling from a really low position to a really high position and back again to a low position. So no matter what the astronomer may explain to dismiss what I'm saying, you can believe the evidence of what you're seeing. What you're seeing is not an illusion, and that's what I have seen, and that's not the end of it. I taught at the beginning of the Gaian navigation experiment that if you observe the lunar apsides, you can follow the motion of yaw of the mothership, how she heads away from a direct path due to the currents in the galactic arm and shifts or swivels slightly to the right or to the left. The observations that I've made over the last week show the presence of yaw as well. So at the same time that the moon is rising really low one night and a couple of nights later really high, the course of the mother ship is experiencing yaw, swiveling toward the left as I observe it in this ensemble of motions. How do I know that? Well, it has to do with the fact that the north lunar node is coming into close coincidence with the lunar apogee. And that is happening and will happen, and I can give you the precise timing over the next month or two. So at the same time that the moon crosses the ecliptic when it's at its north node, it's also very close to its apogee, which is the point most distant from the Earth. And those 2 points will coincide at a definite moment in the future. But I infer from the proximity of the lunar apogee to the node associated with this anomaly that there is yaw combined with roll. Now, I don't know quite what to make of that yet. I'm going to observe it closely in the coming weeks, and I'll report back to you on that. But as my observations stand at the moment, I can assure you of one thing. The mother ship is undergoing an extreme event of rolling, rocking and rolling from side to side. It is a macro motion that you cannot feel because the magnitude of the mothership is so great, it doesn't allow you to feel it, but you can observe it against the cosmic background, against the celestial background. And it begs the question, this observation begs the question, what's rocking the boat? Why would the mother ship or observations of her journey reveal that she is rolling from side to side in this way, which is non-ordinary and inexplicable, and I don't care what the scientific explanation is. I rely on the evidence of my senses and on the intelligence of my mind to decode what I'm seeing. And this is what I'm seeing. What's rocking the boat? So I'll conclude by saying that I'm not the only one who's seeing this. And I'm calling for verification from others in my little entourage. I call them the crew of the mothership, as distinguished from the mere passengers. And I have a highly trained crew out there around the world. And I'm inquiring to them if they can confirm these observations from their locale of observation on the mothership. But I have witnessed this here with another individual. So it's not just me who's seeing this. In fact, she began to observe these anomalies before I did. And I'll leave you with this little anecdote of a conversation we had a night or two ago as we were discussing this cosmic anomaly. She said, I wonder if it could be grief. I wonder if it could be due to grief. You know, grief is a powerful emotion. And in the past, there are many traditions. They're called funerary customs. And one of them was a public display of grief, wailing aloud and waving the arms in grief. And this custom is still observed in some countries in the world, whereas in so-called Western civilized society, it's not generally acceptable to show or to demonstrate your grief openly and publicly in that way. In many places it still is, and it has been the norm in the past to do so. So you can imagine the expression rolling back and forth in grief. You could roll in grief. I have rolled in grief on the floor, sobbing and screaming when I was grieving the death of my best friend some time ago, some years ago. And it was natural to fall on the floor and roll back and forth and sob and scream in grief. So what's rocking the boat? Enough said. And I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.